last train to darkness. I've always found something oddly comforting about train rides at night. There's a certain rhythm to the clatter of wheels on steel tracks, the dim glow of passing towns, and the occasional flicker of station lights. But that night, the railway turned into something else entirely. Something wrong. It was well past midnight when I boarded the last train home. The station was almost deserted, the air thick with an eerie silence. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed intermittently, casting long, trembling shadows on the platform. I pulled my coat tighter around me as a gust of wind howled through the empty tracks. As I stepped into the train, I noticed something strange. The carriage was nearly empty, except for a few passengers scattered here and there. An old man in the farthest seat, staring blankly out the window. A woman with her head bowed, her face obscured by long, dark hair. And a man in a suit, sitting stiffly with his briefcase clutched tightly in his lap. The doors slid shut with a final hiss, and the train jolted forward. I took a seat near the middle of the carriage and let out a breath. I just needed to get home. Nothing else mattered. The train moved steadily, cutting through the darkness like a knife. The world outside was a void, an endless stretch of black. The lights inside flickered every so often, casting brief shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. Then I noticed something odd. The old man was still staring out the window, but his reflection wasn't right. In the glass, he wasn't looking outside. He was looking at me. I felt a cold prickle crawl up my spine. Swallowing hard, I turned my gaze away, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was exhausted, maybe it was a trick of the dim lighting. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the uneasy feeling remained. Then, the train slowed. That was strange. This line had no stops between the city and my town. But outside, a station loomed, shrouded in fog. The sign was barely readable, the letters worn and faded. My heart pounded as I strained to make them out. Grimshaw Station. I had never heard of this place. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. Cold air rushed in, sending a chill through the compartment. But no one got on. No one got off. The platform was empty, lifeless. Then, just as silently, the doors closed and the train lurched forward. I turned to the old man. He hadn't moved, but his reflection was still looking at me. And now he was smiling. My pulse thundered in my ears. I looked to the woman. Her head was still bowed, but something was wrong with her hands. They were too pale, too stiff, like a mannequin's. The suited man hadn't shifted an inch, his briefcase still gripped tight. The air in the carriage felt heavy, suffocating. The train pressed on through the night, but the next time it slowed, the same thing happened. Another station, another name I didn't recognize. Blackford Halt. Again, the doors opened. Again, no one got on or off. The platform was deserted. The fog outside was denser now, swirling unnaturally, tendrils of mist licking at the windows. Then I heard it. Faint shuffle. It came from the far end of the carriage. My breath hitched as I turned my head, just slightly, and I saw it. A figure was standing in the doorway between compartments. Tall, slender, wrapped in tattered, blackened cloth. His face wasn't there, just a smooth expanse where features should have been. I froze, terror locking my limbs in place. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it watching, staring. The train jerked forward again, and the lights flickered violently. For a brief second, the carriage was plunged into darkness. When they came back on, the figure was gone. I shot up from my seat, my breath ragged. My fellow passengers, they hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. The old man was still grinning in the reflection. The woman's head was still bowed, her hands now completely still, unnatural. And the man in the suit, I realized with a sickening lurch that his chest wasn't rising and falling. He wasn't breathing. None of them were. The train was slowing again. Another station, rail end. The doors opened, and this time, the fog poured in, thick and cloying, filling the carriage like a living thing. My body screamed at me to move, to run, but I was paralyzed. I could barely see my own hands in the murky gloom. A whisper slithered through the air. "You were never supposed to be here." My heart slammed against my ribs. The fog curled around my ankles, climbing higher. I turned desperately, clawing at the emergency exit, but the handle wouldn't budge. Then, one by one, the passengers began to rise. The old man stood first, his neck creaking unnaturally. The woman's head lifted, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all, just hollow darkness. The suited man's grip loosened on his briefcase, his arms falling limply to his sides as he took a stiff, shuddering step forward. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You shouldn't have boarded." A hand, cold as the grave, closed around my wrist. I screamed. The world twisted. The fog swallowed everything. And then, silence. When I woke, I was lying on the cold, hard ground of an abandoned station platform. The train was gone. The tracks were rusted and broken, vanishing into the thick mist. My limbs trembled as I forced myself up. Then I saw the station sign. Grimshaw Station. A hollow scream clawed at my throat. The sound of a train whistle echoed through the mist. Somewhere in the distance, the last train to darkness was still running, and it was waiting for me to board once again. The last train to nowhere. I've always loved the solitude of late-night train rides. There's something about the rhythmic clatter of steel wheels on the tracks, the dimly lit compartments, and the sight of empty stations flickering past that brings an eerie kind of peace. That night, I was the only passenger in my compartment, or so I thought. It was past midnight, and I had just finished a long shift at work. The train I boarded was an old local one, the kind that barely had any travelers at this hour. My destination was a small town 2 hours away, a quiet place surrounded by forests. The train jerked forward, and soon the outside world blurred into streaks of darkness. I leaned back against the seat, exhausted, letting the monotonous motion lull me into a daze. That's when I first noticed it. A strange, almost imperceptible sound, like someone breathing heavily. At first, I dismissed it as the sound of the train itself, but as I focused, I realized it was coming from somewhere close. My eyes darted around the compartment. The seats were empty. The lights flickered slightly. Then I saw something, a reflection in the window. It was faint, barely visible, but I could swear there was a shadowy figure sitting across from me. Slowly, I turned my head, only to find the seat empty. My heart pounded. Maybe I was just tired, seeing things, but something about that reflection unsettled me. It was still there. The figure in the glass did not disappear. I gripped the armrest, my breath shallow. I had two choices. I could ignore it and hope I was imagining things, or I could look directly at the empty seat again. Summoning courage, I turned my gaze once more. This time, something had changed. The overhead luggage rack, where nothing had been before, now held a single, battered suitcase. It was old, the leather peeling, the buckles rusted. But that wasn't what made my blood turn cold. The suitcase was moving, twitched just slightly. Then, a soft thud came from inside it. My hands trembled as I stared at it. It was the same feeling as standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing you shouldn't look down, but being unable to stop yourself. Another thud, louder this time. Then the buckles snapped open on their own. The lid lifted, and a pale, withered hand crawled out. I gasped, pushing myself against the seat as fingers, bony, unnaturally long, emerged, grasping the edge of the case. Then came another hand, and then, impossibly, a head. The thing that pulled itself out did not look human. Its skin was stretched thin over its skull, its eye sockets hollow and black. The mouth was too wide, an unnatural grin stretching across its gaunt face. The body that followed was contorted, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't, and it was looking straight at me. The train lurched violently, and the lights flickered again. In that split second of darkness, I heard it move closer. The lights came back on. It was gone. Only the suitcase remained, shut as if it had never opened. My breathing was ragged, my pulse erratic. I had to get off this train. I stumbled to my feet, gripping the nearest pole for balance as I staggered toward the exit doors. My station was still miles away, but I didn't care. I'd rather jump off the train than stay in that compartment a second longer. I reached for the door handle. It wouldn't budge. Panicked, I banged on the glass, hoping maybe the conductor would hear me. But as I did, I caught sight of my reflection again. This time, I wasn't alone. The figure was behind me. Before I could react, the train lurched again, this time more violently than before. The lights flickered and died, plunging everything into darkness. And then I felt it. Cold fingers wrapped around my shoulders. A breath, hot and foul, against my ear. Then came the whisper, slow and drawn out, like a snake hissing its final words before striking. "You shouldn't have seen me." The train screeched to a halt. The lights returned, and I was no longer on the train. I was standing alone on an abandoned platform. The tracks were rusted, overgrown with weeds. The station sign was barely readable, but when I squinted, I could make it out. Railway station closed since 1965. My head spun. That was impossible. I had boarded a real train. I had been inside a moving carriage just moments ago. A distant sound made my stomach drop. The faint, ghostly chugging of an unseen locomotive. The shrill whistle of a train that no longer existed. Then came the voice, distant yet clear. Next stop, nowhere. The ground beneath my feet rumbled. And the last thing I saw before everything went black was the reflection of something standing right behind me. The train that never ends. The last ride home. It was supposed to be a normal ride home. I had worked late again. The office was empty when I left, the kind of silence that made you feel like you didn't belong there anymore. The streets were slick from an earlier rain, the air thick with humidity. The station was nearly deserted when I got there. 11:53 p.m. The last train would be here in 2 minutes. I hated taking the late train. The passengers always felt off. But that night there were none. Just me. And then, the sound of footsteps behind me. The man in the coat. I turned, expecting to see another late commuter. Instead, I saw a man in a dark coat, standing at the far end of the platform. I swear he hadn't been there a second ago. His posture was stiff, his face obscured by shadows. He wasn't looking at me, but he wasn't not looking at me either. A gust of wind rushed through the station. The tunnel yawned before me, black and endless. Then, in the distance, the faint glow of the train's headlights. Finally, I exhaled. The train pulled into the station with a slow, metallic groan, its brakes screaming. The doors slid open, revealing an empty interior. No conductor, no passengers, just rows of dimly lit seats, stretching into the darkness. I hesitated. Then, the man in the dark coat stepped onto the train without a sound. The doors stayed open, waiting for me. Nowhere to go but in. I didn't want to board. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave. But my apartment was too far to walk. A taxi would take forever. And this was just a normal train, right? Swallowing my nerves, I stepped inside. The air changed instantly. Felt wrong, like I had walked into a place I wasn't supposed to be. The doors slid shut behind me with a heavy finality. The train lurched forward, and I realized the man in the dark coat was gone. A ride through the void. I sat near the door, gripping the metal pole beside me. Outside the window, the tunnel stretched on, black and infinite. I checked my phone. No service. Nothing unusual for an underground station. But the unease in my stomach twisted tighter. Minutes passed, then more. Something was wrong. We hadn't stopped at another station. Hadn't even slowed down. The tunnel outside was still there, unbroken. How long had I been riding? I checked my watch. 12:14 a.m. Then I checked again. 12:14 a.m. And again. 12:14 a.m. The time wasn't changing. The whispering passengers. A chill crawled up my spine. I wasn't alone anymore. There were passengers now. They sat motionless, faces turned away, their clothes wet and stained. I hadn't heard them board, hadn't felt the train stop, yet here they were. A low whisper filled the air. like voices just beyond my understanding. I turned to the nearest figure, heart pounding. "Excuse me, do you know when the next stop is?" Slowly, too slowly, the passenger turned toward me, and I saw their face, or rather, the lack of one, the thing that smiles. Their skin was stretched smooth, as if their face had been erased. No eyes, no nose, just a wide, grinning mouth. It opened. A whisper slithered from the void. "Not your train." I stumbled back. The other passengers began to move, heads snapping toward me one by one, mouths peeling open, whispering in unison, "Not your train, not your train, not your train." The lights flickered violently. The air grew thick, suffocating. And then, a hand gripped my shoulder. The conductor. I turned and saw him. The conductor. His uniform was pristine, his posture stiff, but his face was blurred, as if reality itself refused to define him. He lifted a puncher and clicked it twice. Then he spoke, his voice like static on a dying radio. "Wrong passenger." The train shuddered violently. The passengers shrieked, mouths stretching wider. The windows warped, revealing not a tunnel, but a black abyss lined with moving figures. Figures with too many arms, too many eyes, too many mouths. The conductor reached into his pocket and pulled out a ticket with my name on it, the exit that shouldn't be there. I ran. The train twisted, stretched, pulsed like a living thing. Doors appeared and vanished, replaced by walls of flesh, grasping hands, whispering mouths. The conductor followed, each step a loud metallic clang. Then I saw it, an open door, a platform beyond, bathed in sickly yellow light. I lunged forward, and something cold wrapped around my ankle. The conductor's grip tightened. His blurred face loomed close, and in that static-filled voice, he whispered, "Stay." I kicked, fought, pulled myself free, and then I leapt off the train. Where am I? I landed hard, the ground wet and cold beneath me. The train screamed as it roared into the abyss, vanishing into nothingness. I gasped for air, looked around. I was in a station, but not the one I had left. The signs were rusted, the benches crumbling. Old posters from decades ago peeled from the walls, and there was no exit. A single flickering light buzzed overhead. Then, a whisper. From behind me, I turned, and my blood froze. There, standing in the middle of the empty platform, was the man in the dark coat. He smiled and stepped toward me. The last thing I heard was the distant screech of an approaching train. The last train. Some nights never leave you. Some nights change you. I was coming home late from work, exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that makes your bones feel hollow. The city was quiet, the streets slick with the remnants of an evening rain. The station, usually bustling, was eerily empty. 11:47 p.m. I checked the schedule. The last train would arrive in 3 minutes. It was just me on the platform, or so I thought. The man in the distance. A figure stood near the edge of the platform, motionless. I hadn't noticed him when I arrived. Something about him was off. He was too still, not shifting his weight, not checking his phone, not even breathing as far as I could tell. I glanced up at the clock. 11:49 p.m. Just one more minute. I turned my gaze forward, staring into the dark tunnel, waiting for the faint glow of the approaching train. The air felt heavy, pressing against my skin. Then, a whisper, not from the man, from directly behind me, the whisper that wasn't there. I spun around. Nothing, just the empty platform. But when I turned back toward the man, he was closer. Not by much, just a few steps forward. I hadn't heard him move. I tried to shake it off. Long day, paranoia. The train would be here any second. Then I heard it again. A whisper, right in my ear. I felt the breath. Cold. Wrong. A shiver crawled down my spine as I took a step forward, away from whatever wasn't there. The tunnel remained dark. Where was the train? I checked the clock. 11:50 p.m. It should have arrived. The train that never came. I turned back toward the man, and my heart stopped. He was standing right beside me. His clothes were tattered, wet, dripping onto the concrete. His face was wrong, his eyes too deep, his mouth slightly open, like he was trying to speak but had forgotten how. The air turned frigid. I staggered back. His lips moved, and then he vanished. Not faded, not stepped away, just gone. And in his place on the concrete floor, a single wet footprint, the tunnel's breath. I was done waiting. Something was wrong. I turned toward the exit, but the stairwell was gone. Not blocked, not hidden, just not there anymore. My breath hitched. My heartbeat pounded. I wasn't imagining this. The entire station had shifted. The walls seemed taller, the shadows deeper. A low wind rushed through the tunnel. Not the kind a train makes, the kind that breathes. I turned back toward the tracks, and the darkness stared back. Passengers that shouldn't be there. A dim light flickered inside the tunnel. A train. But it wasn't coming from the right direction. It was already here. A single carriage, silent, waiting. The doors slid open. Inside, figures sat in perfect stillness, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces cast in shadows. None of them moved. I stepped forward, and the whisper came again. "You don't want to get on." I froze. Came from beside me, from someone who wasn't there. The conductor. A figure emerged from the train. The conductor. His uniform was pristine, but his face was blurred, like a photograph taken in motion. He lifted his hand and gestured. For me, every part of me screamed no, but my feet moved on their own. The train's interior was wrong. The seats stretched too far. The passengers weren't breathing. Their heads snapped toward me all at once. And then, the train lurched forward. A journey to nowhere. The windows showed nothing. No city, no tunnels, just endless, twisting blackness. The conductor moved down the aisle, his blurred face never turning, as if scanning the passengers. Then he stopped, right beside me. He leaned in, and in a voice that sounded like static and rust, he whispered, "You should not be here." I couldn't move. The passengers began to smile. Wide, too wide, their lips peeling back too far, revealing black voids where their teeth should be. The conductor reached into his pocket and pulled out a ticket. My name was on it. I felt my blood freeze. Then, the train slammed to a stop. The missing time. The doors hissed open. The station. Not the one I left. This one was crumbling, overgrown. The lights flickering weakly. The conductor stepped aside, waiting for me to leave. My legs finally obeyed. I stumbled out, the air thick with dust and decay. The moment I was off, the doors snapped shut. The train lurched backward and vanished into the tunnel. Where was I? I turned. The station was dead silent. The signs were rusted, the walls covered in graffiti that looked like scratched out words. Then I saw it. The exit. I ran. Up the stairs, lungs burning, legs shaking. And when I reached the top, I was home. My city. My street. The same rain-slick pavement. But my phone. For 12 a.m. I had been gone for hours. I checked the news. There was nothing about delays, nothing about missing trains. But there was one article that made my stomach drop. Ghost train of line 13. The midnight disappearance. I clicked it and saw a grainy black and white photo of the passengers I had seen, of the conductor with the blurred face, and at the bottom, a note from a survivor. If you see the train, do not board. Do not make eye contact. Do not listen to the whispers. And if the conductor gives you a ticket, run.